Bibi's fulfillment of a 30-year mission to try to drag the United States into a war with Iran?
Absolutely. There is no intrinsic reason why the United States should be at war with Iran. We are in this war because of Israel. Well, because Benjamin Netanyahu told him to. So the president followed his orders.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. We take complex sources, articles, research, and really distill them down into the essential knowledge you need.
That's right. We cut through the noise to get to the core insights.
And today, we are diving deep into something, well, profoundly shocking. It's an assertion about U.S. foreign policy that really challenges how many of us think about international relations.
It certainly does.
We're going to be grappling with the recent bombing of Iran and a very provocative claim made by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's a renowned economist, a policy expert.
And his claim is quite something.
It is. His central statement, and frankly it's stunning, is that the United States bombed Iran simply because, and I quote, Netanyahu told them to.
Wow.
Yeah, effectively framing the U.S. as, well, alarmingly subordinate to Israeli commands. It's a claim that, if it holds water, has monumental implications.
Monumental is the right word. The gravity of that statement, as you say it, you really can't be overstated. Professor Sachs isn't just, offering a critique here. He's suggesting a deeply troubling direction for U.S. foreign policy, implying it's run by external interests, not its own national priorities.
Exactly.
So, our mission today is precisely that, to trace the historical lineage of this assertion. We need to expose an alternative narrative to the usual idea of, inherent Iranian aggression.
Right. The standard story we hear.
And uncover this decades-long strategic blueprint that, according to Professor Sachs, has been meticulously driving these events all along.
And confront the implications.
Yes. Ultimately, we have to confront the catastrophic implications Sachs warns about, particularly that very real threat of escalating global conflict. It's going to be a journey, no doubt, through complex, often uncomfortable history. But our aim is to provide you, the listener, with a perspective that's truly well-informed, one that challenges that mainstream understanding and encourages, deeper critical thinking about the forces really at play.
Absolutely. And the urgency here feels palpable, doesn't it? What Sachs is laying out, it isn't just some academic theory or a passing comment.
No, it feels very current.
It's a living history unfolding right now with potentially devastating consequences for global peace, for security. So we're going to unpack the layers of this story with, the academic rigor it needs. We'll follow a clear, chronological, analytical approach to understand how we got here to this really pivotal and, let's be honest, deeply concerning moment.
The core assertion U.S. foreign policy is subordinated to external demands.
Okay, so let's unpack this startling claim right out of the gate. Professor Sachs asserts the U.S. bombed Iran because Netanyahu told them to. That sounds incredibly direct, almost, conspiratorial to some ears. What exactly does he mean by that? What's the evidence he points to for such a strong statement?
He is remarkably direct. There's really no ambiguity in what he's saying. He states quite unequivocally that President Trump's decision to bomb Iran happened simply because, quote, Benjamin Netanyahu told him to, so the president followed his order.
Followed orders.
Yes. For Sachs, any, small question mark that might have existed before about U.S. subordination to Israel's demands is, as he puts it, now absolutely clear. This isn't some subtle hint. It's a stark declaration of, frankly, an alarming state of affairs. It implies a direct chain of command.
A direct command. That flies in the face of everything we usually hear about U.S. foreign policy, right? That it's driven by national interest. Does Sachs address this? Was this action somehow good for America, or was there something else going on?
No, quite the opposite. Sachs explicitly argues this action was not in America's interest. Not at all.
Yeah.
He highlights a critical counter-narrative to the official story, the one about it being a necessary defensive strike or something. According to Sachs, the very time this bombing happened, the U.S. was actually involved in delicate diplomatic efforts. They were in the process of negotiating a settlement with Iran.
Really?
Yes. There was apparently a 6th round of negotiations underway, which suggests, a diplomatic path was open. But Sachs asserts Israel intervened directly, insisted, no, you do it our way.
Wow.
And in Sachs's words, the President of the United States said, yes, sir. It paints this chilling picture of a direct external override of active U.S. diplomacy. It suggests American interests were just pushed aside for an agenda set somewhere else.
That's extraordinary.
And he gets more specific. He references testimony given under oath by former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard back in March.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
Gabbard stated that her professional reading, based on the intelligence community consensus, was that Iran was not developing a nuclear weapon, didn't have one, and actually hadn't been actively developing one since way back in 2002.
2002? Why then?
Reportedly because of a religious fatwa that's a binding Islamic legal ruling issued by Iran's supreme leader, which actually prohibited developing nuclear weapons.
A religious prohibition.
Yes. So Sachs's interpretation of President Trump's decision to bomb, especially in the face of this intelligence consensus, is that Trump basically ignored verified information. He got his otherwise, as Sachs puts it, from Benjamin Netanyahu and Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency.
So disregarding U.S. intelligence in favor of Israeli intelligence.
That's the implication. Sachs concludes very bluntly, this is not American policy, this is Netanyahu's policy. It's a profound accusation. It suggests foreign influence just superseded both U.S. national intelligence and active diplomatic efforts.
That really is an extraordinary claim that U.S. foreign policy on something so critical is being run by an external entity, not its own intelligence or diplomats. Sachs uses this powerful analogy, doesn't he, about the war machine to describe the momentum in U.S. foreign policy. How does he connect that to the deeper power structures in the U.S.? Like it's some kind of default setting.
He does. It's a very vivid analogy. He describes what he sees as this constant, almost self-fueling drive towards conflict within U.S. foreign policy. Sachs argues that the main job of the President of the United States is to keep the foot on the brake of the war machine.
Keep the foot on the brake.
Because as he puts it, it's always revving. This machine, always looking for intervention, for conflict, it's propelled by various entrenched forces. And in Trump's specific case, Sachs contends the president took his foot off the brake because Bibi Netanyahu told him to.
So not just one decision, but a systemic issue.
Exactly. It suggests a systemic vulnerability to external pressure and a kind of default setting towards military action unless someone is actively consciously restraining it.
And this war machine isn't just abstract, is it? He connects it to real power centers.
No, not abstract at all for Sachs. He connects it directly to the huge influence of what he calls the donor class, these wealthy individuals, groups, who pour money into political campaigns.
Campaign finance.
He states this class has an ironclad grip on an overwhelming majority of both houses of the United States Congress and on the White House itself. This financial power, he argues, creates this strong incentive structure that aligns U.S. policy with certain external interests, especially, he implies, those of the Israel lobby, which he sees as a major part of this donor class.
But it goes deeper than just money.
He suggests it does. He claims this influence is deeply embedded in the CIA and in the security agencies. He specifically notes that CIA and Mossad work hand in hand.
Wow.
Which implies a level of operational coordination, shared objectives that, in Sachs's view, just blur the lines of national interest and accountability. It suggests foreign policy is run by a deep state, that term for entrenched, maybe unelected officials or powerful external groups who he believes maintain continuity in foreign policy no matter who's actually president.
That is a truly chilling assessment. Controversial, definitely, that the U.S. foreign policy machine is essentially operating on someone else's leash. And what about Israel's actions themselves? Sachs calls them brazenly violent, brazenly illegal. How does he illustrate that audacity, that perceived impunity?
He paints a scenario that, for him, just perfectly highlights Israel's disregard for international norms and, crucially, the complicity of the West. He describes a situation where Israel launches an absolutely unprovoked war.
Okay.
Yet in this bizarre, almost surreal twist, all the countries in Europe and the United States direct their warning to Iran not to escalate.
Wait, warn Iran, the one attacked.
Exactly. Sachs uses this vivid, deliberately absurd analogy. He likens it to one kid punches the other in the face and everyone yells at the one punched in the face, don't retaliate.
That is absurd.
He emphasizes it is meant to be ridiculous. It's a show of brazenness, designed to demonstrate that Israel believes it can act with total impunity, totally confident in U.S. backing no matter what.
And this isn't just about actions, but words too. Declarations.
Absolutely. This brazenness, Sachs argues, extends to explicit declarations of intent. He points to an Israeli minister's reported social media post. Next year in Tehran. He calls that disgusting vulgarity.
Next year in Tehran. That's pretty blatant.
It's not subtle, is it? It explicitly signals a desire for regime change in Iran openly flaunting aggressive intentions even while the world is calling for de-escalation. The implication, from Sachs's viewpoint, is that Israel feels so sure of unwavering U.S. support that it can just openly declare its plans to overthrow sovereign governments, regardless of international law or the potentially devastating consequences. It's almost like an open declaration of a specific long-term goal.
The deep historical roots dismantling the official narrative of Iranian aggression.
Okay, this analysis of today's dynamics is incredibly provocative, and it really begs the question: how did we get here? What's the history? What context does Professor Sachs highlight to explain this dramatic situation, especially when the official narrative we usually hear paints Iran as the main aggressor?
Well, to really get it, Sachs insists we have to go beyond the simplified modern story of Iranian hostility. We need to ground ourselves in Iran's ancient history.
Ancient history? How far back?
He describes Iran as one of the great civilizations in the world, noting it was the first great empire of the ancient world at large scale. This isn't just, historical trivia.
Right.
It's crucial for establishing Iran's long, rich heritage. It contrasts sharply with portrayals that often just strip it of its historical depth and paint it as this perpetually aggressive, modern rogue state. He really emphasizes that this historical view is key to understanding why the current animosity is, in his view, so artificial.
Artificial. Interesting. Is there a specific historical point he makes about that?
There is, and it's truly surprising, often completely overlooked today. It's a specific detail from the Hebrew Bible.
From the Bible, relating to Iran.
Yes. In it, the ancient Persian leader Cyrus the Great is actually called the Messiah of the Jewish people.
Messiah.
It sounds strange now, doesn't it? But it's profoundly significant because back in the 6th century BC, Cyrus rescued the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity. He allowed them to return and rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem.
I had no idea about that connection.
Most people don't. Sachs emphasizes this point to argue there's no intrinsic reason for the kind of hatred and vitriol we see today between these cultures. Instead, he asserts this animosity is provoked by propaganda and a deliberate misreading of history. It deliberately hides a long, complex, and sometimes deeply cooperative past. This reframing just fundamentally challenges the idea of some ancient inherent conflict.
It really does reframe things. If there's no intrinsic hatred, then when did this relationship truly start to go wrong, according to Sachs? Where does he pinpoint the right starting point for the mess we're in now?
For Sachs, the right starting point for the current situation is crystal clear. It's a pivotal event in 1953, the U.S.-backed coup.
1953. Mossadegh?
Exactly. He details how Britain and the U.S. took great offense when Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry.
Because he said the oil belonged to Iran.
Precisely. Mossadegh's declaration, simple but powerful, "The oil under our sand is ours," was seen as a direct threat to Western control over Iran's massive resources, especially by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British entity that basically controlled Iran's oil wealth then.
So the West reacted.
They did. The U.S., working with the U.K., orchestrated Mossadegh's overthrow and, as Sachs puts it, put in a police state. They installed the Shah's regime, which then lasted until 1978.
A police state backed by the U.S. and U.K.
Yes. This intervention, Sachs argues, planted deep seeds of resentment. It laid the groundwork for future hostility. It was a clear moment when Western interests directly crushed Iranian sovereignty and democracy. It's an intervention that, in his view, absolutely set the stage for so much of what followed.
Okay, so 1953 is the starting point. Then we jump to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. For many Americans, that's probably the first real memory of Iran, mainly because of the hostage crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does Sachs connect that revolution and the U.S. reaction to this ongoing history?
Well, the Shah's regime, the one put in place with US-UK backing, it profoundly alienated Iranian society. Decades of brutal police measures, corruption, suppression of any dissent.
So the revolution wasn't out of nowhere.
Not at all. It led directly to the Shah's overthrow in the 1979 revolution. Then came the hostage crisis, where students overran the U.S. embassy. That was ignited when the U.S. took in the ailing Shah for cancer treatment, a move seen in Iran as siding with the deposed dictator against the people's will.
And the U.S. reaction to the hostage crisis.
Sachs is scathing about it. He says there was no attempt whatsoever to understand what is this about? Why do the Iranians express their hatred to the United States? He suggests Americans are not good at history, don't want to take any responsibility or understand any background for their actions.
A failure to look inward, basically.
Exactly. This deep lack of historical self-awareness, he argues, just perpetuated a narrative of unprovoked Iranian aggression rather than acknowledging the deep roots of Iranian anger stemming from decades of foreign interference.
And did it stop at diplomatic tension?
Not even close. This lack of understanding quickly escalated into direct conflict. Sachs details how the United States almost immediately went into combat against the new Iranian regime. Not directly, but in the 1980s, the U.S., through various channels, actively armed and funded Saddam Hussein's Iraq to launch a very, very violent war against Iran.
Arming Saddam against Iran.
Yes, this incredibly brutal war lasted 8 years, killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. Iran suffered immensely. Sachs explicitly states that the war with Iran already goes back to the 1980s. He frames it not as some near antagonism, but a long-standing U.S.-supported aggression against Iran.
That completely flips the script on who the aggressor was back then.
It profoundly contradicts the common notion of Iran as the sole aggressor in the modern era. It reveals this continuous pattern of external intervention aimed at destabilizing or weakening the Iranian state.
Okay, so we have the 53 coup, the 79 revolution, the U.S. backing Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. But where does Israel fit into this long narrative, especially given their central role in Sachs's analysis now as the main driver for U.S. action?
Israel's role, particularly under Benjamin Netanyahu, becomes absolutely critical in shaping U.S. policy towards Iran during this whole period. Sachs explains that Israel came to view the post-revolution Iranian regime as a mortal threat.
Why specifically a mortal threat then?
Because the new Iranian regime, being an Islamist state, openly supported the Palestinian cause and groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. For Netanyahu's Likud party, that's the conservative nationalist party in Israel and its broader Greater Israel movement, which advocates for expanded Israeli borders, well, Sachs explains, any supporter of the Palestinian cause is a mortal enemy.
So support for Palestinians made Iran the enemy.
Consequently, Iran quickly became mortal enemy number one for Likud and Netanyahu's Israel. This was regardless of its nuclear ambitions or lack thereof at the time. This ideological stance positioned Iran as the primary adversary long before the nuclear issue really became the dominant public focus.
And this leads to the clean break document.
Exactly. This brings us to this crucial and, quite controversial document, the 1996 Clean Break Strategy, officially titled A Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm. It was prepared for Benjamin Netanyahu, who was just becoming Prime Minister of Israel then, by a group of American neoconservatives and prominent Israeli strategists.
And what was its core strategy?
Sachs emphasizes its core idea. You don't fight groups like Hamas and Hezbollah by fighting these militant groups head-on. You fight them by bringing down the governments that support them.
Whoa. So regime change as official strategy.
It was a clear, proactive blueprint for regime change, targeting sovereign states, not just non-state actors. It was a radical shift from traditional containment policies.
Is that a goal?
Sachs emphasizes that Netanyahu's vision, laid out in Clean Break, was explicitly about remaking the governments of the Middle East in Israel's image. This meant actively working to overthrow any governments that are supporting the Palestinian cause.
And Iran was top of that list.
Explicitly named as number one on the list. The strategy wasn't just defensive, it was deeply interventionist, expansive. So Sachs reiterates his central point with stark clarity. These new events are the culmination of 30 years of Netanyahu's campaign to bring the United States into war with Iran.
30 years.
This whole historical context, stretching back decades, positions the recent bombing not as some isolated incident, but as the latest, deeply disturbing fulfillment of a long-term, carefully executed geopolitical strategy devised and pushed, according to Sachs, by very specific interests.
Iran's nuclear stance and missed opportunities for peace.
That is a truly extensive and frankly unsettling historical setup. It really shifts how you might view the origins, the drivers of this conflict. But what about the immediate issue, Iran's nuclear program? Professor Sachs talks about this official narrative of Iranian aggression, often centered on nuclear ambitions. What does he reveal about Iran's actual stance, their willingness to negotiate, things that often seem ignored or just dismissed?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital to unpack that common narrative of Iran just relentlessly seeking nuclear weapons. Because Sachs presents crucial facts, often ignored facts, that really contradict this. He states that for decades, Iranians have consistently communicated both publicly and privately things like, we want normal relations with the United States, and fundamentally, we do not want nuclear weapons.
For decades.
Yes. He argues this isn't some new tactical position they've adopted for convenience. It's long-standing, deeply rooted, and consistently misrepresented.
And what about that fatwa you mentioned earlier?
That's even more crucial. It's a point almost entirely left out of mainstream discussion. Iran's religious supreme leader issued decades ago a religious ruling, a fatwa, that said Iran will not have nuclear weapons.
A religious ruling against nukes.
Yes. And this isn't just politics or diplomacy. It's a deeply embedded religious prohibition. It carries immense weight within their society, their leadership. And this fatwa has been consistently communicated to the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog. This religious edict just profoundly complicates the narrative that Iran is secretly, aggressively pursuing nukes. It suggests either a fundamental misunderstanding or perhaps a deliberate misrepresentation of their real intentions.
So if they've been saying they don't want nukes, and there's this religious ruling against them, have they actually tried to engage diplomatically, to act on this stated desire for normal relations, for verifiable, peaceful nuclear energy?
Yes, consistently, persistently, for decades. Sachs shares his own personal experience here. He says Iranian academics, senior officials, have been coming to him for decades saying, we want to negotiate with your government, we want to normalize relations.
For decades, they've been reaching out.
It's not just a recent plea, it's been this persistent, multi-generational effort by various Iranian administrations, civil society leaders, trying to open dialogue. He emphasizes they are open for an agreement where they are inspected and monitored for a civilian nuclear power program, which, as he points out, any country can have under international law. This highlights a continuous diplomatic effort from Iran that just profoundly contradicts the picture of some unyielding, aggressive, secretive regime hell-bent on building bombs.
And this willingness led to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
Exactly. That willingness culminated in a major diplomatic achievement. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, negotiated in 2015 by President Obama and other world powers.
And that deal was designed to prevent a weapon.
Yes. It was a landmark agreement specifically designed to prevent a nuclear weapons program. Sachs clarifies that, according to international inspectors, the Iranians weren't engaged in one at the time anyway, but the agreement was structured with incredibly robust verification, monitoring, and limits to the uranium enrichment to absolutely ensure they wouldn't develop one. It was a comprehensive diplomatic solution. It addressed international concerns while still respecting Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy under very strict oversight.
But that agreement, the JCPOA, it didn't last, did it? The U.S. abandoned it, which paved the way for renewed tensions for the current situation. What happened there? How does that fit into Sachs's argument about external influence driving U.S. policy?
Its collapse is a critical point in Sachs's story of missed opportunities. He explains simply, Donald Trump got elected, the Israel lobby went to work, and Trump walked out of the JCPOA.
Just walked out.
This unilateral U.S. action, he argues, abandoned an agreement that would have obviated all of this current conflict, this nuclear standoff. The walkout wasn't based on any new Iranian violations, but rather, as Sachs asserts, on political pressure from external interests.
And did Iran stop trying after the U.S. pulled out?
No. Even after that huge setback, Sachs observed Iranian efforts continuing. Throughout both the Trump and Biden administrations, he says Iranians consistently approached him, asking, do you have an inroad to the White House? Why don't they listen to us? We want to negotiate. This shows a persistent desire for a diplomatic fix from the Iranian side, despite what they saw as U.S. provocations and abandoning prior agreements.
So who or what does Sachs blame for preventing this understanding, for pushing towards conflict instead?
He's unsparingly direct about the force he believes is blocking understanding and pushing for war. He states flatly, the Israel lobby works overtime to prevent the American people from understanding any of this, and it's all one giant lie, that the only way is through war and regime change.
A giant lie. Strong words.
He paints a picture of this carefully constructed, pervasive narrative designed purely to push for conflict and regime change, not diplomacy. And he links this directly to what he calls Trump's delusion. This belief that bombing Iran means it's all over now, all they have to do is concede at the negotiating table.
Like bombing solves everything.
Right. Sachs views this approach as a, quote, kind of stupidity compounding on this underlying deep state reality, where a complex geopolitical situation gets reduced to these simplistic, aggressive solutions that ultimately serve external agendas, not, genuine American national interests.
The 30-year neocon blueprint and catastrophic global outcomes.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe disturbing. If what Professor Sachs is describing is a long-term plan, a specific blueprint going back decades,
Yeah.
What's been its practical application over the last few decades? And what have been the real, often catastrophic consequences for the U.S., for the world, according to his analysis?
Well, Sachs lays out a truly chilling detail that seems to connect these apparently separate conflicts into one cohesive long-term strategy. He recounts seeing a highly disturbing memo right after 9/11 back in 2001.
A memo. What did it say?
It outlined a plan, he says, to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
7 countries in 5 years, ending with Iran. That is specific.
Chillingly specific. He starkly notes the precision of this blueprint, stating that 6 out of those 7 we've been engaged in quite actively. And Iran, with the recent attack, just started yesterday, meaning the final piece of this decades-old puzzle appears to be falling into place now. This 7 countries memo, which others have discussed independently too, serves as this direct, almost prophetic blueprint for U.S. interventionism in the region over the last 20 years. And it aligns perfectly with the strategic goals of the Clean Break document.
And the results of targeting these countries, were they successes?
Far from it. Sachs then goes on to detail the catastrophic failures for each of these countries. He demonstrates how this strategic blueprint led to widespread devastation, instability, not the intended stability or democratic reforms.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. For Iraq, he just notes, people will remember that one was on the list. The invasion, based on bad intelligence, led to a prolonged, incredibly costly war, massive sectarian violence, a fragile state still plagued by instability today. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced.
And Syria.
In Syria, the CIA was tasked to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. That venture spanned 14 years and hundreds of thousands of dead. It led to a brutal civil war, displaced half the population, allowed extremist groups to rise. Sachs notes, unsettlingly, there's now a jihadist as head of Syria in some areas, a complete failure of the initial goals.
What about the others? Lebanon, Sudan?
In Lebanon, the U.S. backed Israel to invade Lebanon, which contributed to long-term instability, a weakened state. For Sudan, the U.S. supported a rebellion that ultimately broke the country in 2, creating not 1, but 2 civil wars, ongoing humanitarian crises.
Libya.
The 2011 intervention to overthrow Gaddafi led to a situation where 14 years later, and the place is in chaos. Competing governments, widespread militias, a refugee crisis, and Somalia, another target on that list, he describes as having not even a government, just perpetually stuck in internal conflict.
So, a trail of devastation.
Sachs sums it up starkly, a 4,000-kilometer swath running from Libya to Iran of devastation. And he connects this directly back to Netanyahu's core idea from Clean Break, this utterly delusional belief that assassinating leaders and overthrowing governments would somehow be met with cheers, bring stability, democratic transition.
Which clearly didn't happen.
No. Sachs adamantly states this delusional approach brings us closer and closer to complete disaster. He underscores the tragic, counterproductive, profoundly destabilizing nature of this decades-long strategy. It consistently failed its stated aims while causing just immense human suffering.
That is a devastating scorecard, a really sobering picture of consequences, intended or otherwise. If the U.S. has been pursuing this blueprint, basically spreading chaos across the Middle East, what does that say about America's standing in the world? Professor Sachs doesn't mince words, does he? He calls the U.S. a rogue state. What does he mean by that? What are the implications?
He presents this stark statistical analysis. It profoundly challenges America's self-image as, a beacon of democracy and international law. He states that the United States, of the 193 UN member states, is the least aligned with the UN Charter.
Least aligned, out of 193.
Yes. And then he adds that Israel is next, or close to the bottom, in terms of adhering to international norms and UN resolutions. This isn't just his opinion, it's a quantitative assessment of consistent non-compliance with global legal frameworks.
What does least aligned mean in practice?
He elaborates. The U.S. doesn't vote with the rest of the world on critical resolutions. It votes against the large majorities on key issues, human rights, Palestinian statehood, you name it. He points out the U.S. participates least in UN treaties, mentioning withdrawal from climate agreements, not ratifying various human rights treaties, historically failing to even pay its UN dues.
So, actively ignoring the international system.
Sachs critiques this behavior as a kind of putting a finger to the rest of the world, sending a clear, unapologetic message. What we want is everyone to be afraid. We'll send our bunker busters if another country that we happen to support breaks the law, so what we won't say a word about it.
That's blunt.
His conclusion is equally blunt, intentionally provocative.
Yeah, that's-
Statistical sense. We're a rogue state, and some are proud of it. It's a fundamental challenge to the whole idea of American exceptionalism, its self-proclaimed role as a global leader upholding a rules-based order.
So the U.S. is described as a rogue state, creating devastation. What about Israel, the supposed driving force behind this blueprint, according to Sachs? Is Israel benefiting? Or is it also facing negative consequences, despite all the U.S. backing?
Well, despite that unwavering, historically unprecedented U.S. support, Sachs emphasizes a critical paradox. Israel is, in his view, experiencing its worst insecurity in its history by far because it is utterly isolated in the international system.
Worse insecurity, despite U.S. backing.
Yes, because of the isolation. He points to the UN as the clearest indicator. He states that 95% of the world population is voting against Israel right now on resolutions about the Palestinian issue. There's an overwhelming call for the absolutely practical state of Palestine being established on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. That's the internationally recognized pre-Six-Day War borders.
So the world is united against their position.
Overwhelmingly. Sachs reiterates his belief that Israel has achieved nothing except a wasteland in its neighborhood through the strategy of perpetual conflict and expansion. He argues true, long-term security for Israel doesn't lie in more conflict, occupation, settlement expansion.
I mean, what then?
But in rejoining the family of nations, by adhering to international law, by allowing a Palestinian state to finally be established. This vision is the complete opposite of the current strategy, which he sees as profoundly self-defeating, leading only to greater insecurity and international pariah status for Israel itself. The current path, he insists, is just a dead end.
And at the heart of this strategy, for 30 years now, has been Benjamin Netanyahu. The architect Sachs identifies for this long campaign to get the U.S. into war with Iran. What's Professor Sachs's final, unfiltered take on Netanyahu's leadership, his legacy?
Sachs offers an exceptionally scathing condemnation. He calls Netanyahu nuts, a failure for 30 years, and the biggest warmonger on the planet.
Nuts. Failure. Warmonger. Strong words.
Very strong. He recalls with clear frustration Netanyahu's infamous 2002 speech to the U.S. Congress. That's where he enthusiastically pushed for the Iraq War, predicting it would be a cakewalk and would inspire this wave of democracy across the region.
A prediction that turned out very wrong.
Catastrophically wrong. It led instead to widespread chaos, destabilization. This historical record, in Sachs's view, just underscores Netanyahu's profound misjudgment and his dangerous influence over the years.
Does Sachs offer any advice then? A different path.
He delivers a direct, urgent message. It seems aimed particularly at former President Trump, but really it applies to any U.S. leader considering this path. If Trump wants a successful presidency, don't sign on to this idiocy. Do your job, Mr. President. Make peace in the region. Stop the genocide and go along with international law.
Make peace, follow law.
It's Sachs's impassioned plea for a complete radical U-turn on the existing foreign policy track. He's urging a return to diplomacy, adherence to international law, a focus on genuine peace, human rights, not this perpetual war he believes is driven by external agendas. He sees it as the only responsible path forward for American leadership.
The ultimate warning, a world pushed towards nuclear war.
So what does all this mean for us? For the listeners, for the world? Professor Sachs paints this incredibly dire picture of the consequences of this long strategy, the current path. But what's his ultimate warning? Where does this policy specifically lead, especially regarding the existential threat? Nuclear war. This is where the academic urgency really hits home, isn't it?
It really does. Professor Sachs pivots to what he sees as the single most critical, most alarming implication of continuing down this foreign policy road: the reckless proximity to nuclear war.
Closer to nuclear war.
He asserts that the U.S., despite its geographic safety, its immense conventional military power, is actively taking steps that bring us closer to nuclear war. He clarifies that this, and only this, is the only thing that conceivably threatens the United States on an existential level. The idea that a strong military or big oceans can protect America is just completely irrelevant when you're talking about nuclear conflict. He sees it as this ever-present, escalating danger.
And bombing nuclear sites in Iran doesn't solve that.
Not even close. Sachs emphasizes that bombing 3 purported nuclear sites in Iran doesn't resolve or end the nuclear issue in any way. Instead, he warns, this escalation of conflict inevitably means we step ever closer to nuclear war one way or another.
How so?
The danger is magnified by the chilling reality that the world is just filled with nuclear weapons, not just in the hands of the big powers. He points out that Iran has strong allies who do have nuclear capabilities, specifically mentioning North Korea and Pakistan,
Allies with nukes.
who, in a desperate situation facing an existential threat, could imagine a situation in which they would make their nukes available to Iran. The idea, he says, that Israel's leaders, talking about regime change and killing Iranian leaders, is going to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon is, in Sachs's blunt assessment, simply stupid.
Stupid.
Yes, it's a delusional strategy that, far from reducing the nuclear threat, actually amplifies it. It pushes the entire world closer to the brink of unimaginable catastrophe.
So the path we're on is incredibly dangerous, seems to lead towards this almost inevitable catastrophic end. But is there a way out? Does Professor Sachs see a simple, viable path to peace? Or are we just locked into this cycle of violence and escalation?
He firmly believes peace is within reach. And what's more, the path to it is surprisingly straightforward and globally supported.
Really?
He argues that a two-state solution in Palestine and Israel, establishing an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, wouldn't just resolve that core, long-standing conflict. Crucially, he believes it would also stop the wars in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and across the Red Sea.
One solution stops multiple wars.
That's his argument. He points out that over 180 countries support this two-state solution. That's a staggering 95% of the world's population. It's the overwhelming international consensus.
So how could the U.S. achieve it?
He highlights how easily the U.S. can make it happen by simply not vetoing UN resolutions for Palestinian statehood. It puts it very plainly. All the United States has to do is to say we go along with all the rest of the world and tell Israel, wake up, we're saving you. The path, in his view, isn't even complicated. It just requires political will and adherence to international law.
But he doesn't think it's likely to happen.
No. Despite the simplicity, despite the broad international support, Sachs laments the stark unlikelihood of this path being followed by the current U.S. administration. He states that it's not even complicated, but it's unlikely to be the one that this administration follows.
So
Instead, he warns, we're likely to remain on a path of violence, destruction, and escalation that's extraordinarily dangerous. And that's the core tragedy of his analysis. A clear, viable, internationally backed path to peace is consistently ignored, he believes, in favor of this destructive trajectory driven by external interests, leading to potentially catastrophic global outcomes.
that is a truly sobering assessment, a stark warning for our times. What then is Professor Sachs's ultimate overarching message about the state of the world if we keep going this way? What's the core problem as he sees it that needs fixing most urgently?
Sachs concludes with his most profound, most urgent warning. The current approach, driven by what he calls the deep state and these external interests, is systematically turning the world into one that is completely lawless with nuclear weapons galore.
Lawless with nuclear weapons galore.
He stresses that this consistent disregard for international law, for global consensus, for established norms, coupled with the relentless spread of nuclear weapons and the breakdown of arms control, it just creates an utterly untenable, existentially threatening global environment. He reinforces the idea that fixing this requires a completely different approach, a fundamental shift in mindset, in policy.
Focused on what?
Focused on actively making peace, upholding international law, and crucially, moving towards global nuclear disarmament. This, he reminds us, isn't just some noble aspiration. It's actually a binding U.S. obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a powerful call for a complete reorientation of U.S. foreign policy away from confrontation towards global cooperation to avoid a potential global catastrophe. Outro.
So what stands out to you from this deep dive? We've traced this remarkable, often deeply unsettling narrative, from that immediate assertion about U.S. foreign policy being dictated by external forces through decades of history, intervention, right up to these stark warnings about the true cost. It's a lot to process when you connect all those threads, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Professor Sachs fundamentally challenges us, doesn't he? He forces us to reconsider who really benefits from these persistent conflicts. What are the real drivers of global policy beyond the headlines, beyond the official statements? It raises that important question for all of us. In this world of just endless information, are we truly understanding the sources, the motivations behind the news? Or are we maybe being led by narratives that serve specific and potentially quite dangerous agendas? It really compels us to be more discerning, to question those prevailing narratives.
Absolutely. So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener. Given Professor Sachs's powerful analysis that the U.S. has, in statistical sense anyway, become a rogue state by persistently disregarding international law and the will of the global majority, what responsibility does each of us have? To truly understand the impact of our nation's foreign policy on global stability and on this pressing existential threat of nuclear war, what steps can citizens even take when governments seem to operate outside widely accepted international norms, especially when those actions have such profound, such perilous global consequences?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay critical, and definitely keep asking the essential questions.